Good day and welcome once again to Understanding Economics. In our lesson last week, we set out the economic definitions that we're going to be using throughout our study. And we noted that these definitions were in service of the basic question of why is there persistent poverty in a society that seems to be able to produce a great deal of wealth. This week's lesson is going to take up those questions. What are some of the theories that have been advanced to explain the problem of poverty? In other words, is there such a thing as an iron law of wages? We have a very revealing cartoon here in which the workers seem to be going up a never-rising spiral step, always upward but never any higher, while the corporate bosses take the escalator upward to higher profits. Why is there an iron law of wages? Henry George wrote, "It was natural to expect, and it was expected, that labor-saving inventions would lighten the toil and improve the condition of the laborer, that the enormous increase in the power of producing wealth would make real poverty a thing of the past. The association of poverty with progress is the great enigma of our times." Well, it's a complex economy. It's interconnected, and it's competitive. And one of the things we need to make a living, we feel, is capital. We need the equipment. We need the inventory. We need the buildings and the warehouses and the stores. We need to invest in the stuff that enables us to be competitive and to produce a living. So the first theory that we have to look at, if we're going to try to explain persistent poverty, is there a shortage of capital? Do too many people have trouble starting out in making a living because not enough equipment is available for them to use? Capital is all of the material stuff that we use in production, the machines, the tools, the equipment, even the seeds that we plant in crops to enable us to produce more efficiently. So could poverty be caused by a shortage of capital? If so, what needs to be done about that? However, we look around and we notice that it's possible to produce wealth with little or no capital. And we see people making a living in very primitive ways, perhaps not in the most efficient ways, but making a living nonetheless with little or no capital, even producing capital out of the stuff that's lying around. Production can take place with little or no capital. And in fact, our economic definitions give us a clue to the answer to this question. Because let's recall what capital is. Capital is wealth that's used in the process of production, which includes wealth that's in the course of exchange. Capital, in other words, is wealth. Now, what was wealth again? Remember that to be classified as wealth in political economy, it's important that something satisfies all four of these criteria. It's a material thing produced by human labor that satisfies human desires and has exchange value. In other words, capital is a subset of the overall set of wealth. And we had to have enough wealth to satisfy our material desires. We had to have food, clothing, and shelter for ourselves before we could even think of diverting some of it in order to make production more efficient. Capital is a subset of wealth, and human beings who have access to land are able to produce capital. And that's why we can't explain the persistence of poverty by citing a shortage of capital. Now, of course, our economy today is very complex and very interdependent, and there's a great deal of capital used in production. And so the question of capital formation is a relative thing. We have some industries that are more capital intensive, some industries that are more labor intensive. And we have the possibility of capital-intensive industries restricting the number of jobs that are available for people. It could be that there are just too many people. It's possible that our natural tendency to reproduce tends to overstrip the resources that are available to us to provide subsistence. This idea is known as the Malthusian theory. For the economist and parson Thomas Malthus, who wrote in the late 18th century this cheery thought: "The power of population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man, that premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race. The vices of mankind are active and able ministers of depopulation. They are the precursors in the great army of destruction, and often finish the dreadful work themselves. But should they fail in this war of extermination, sickly seasons, epidemics, pestilence, and plague advance in terrific array, and sweep off their thousands and tens of thousands." In other words, Malthus theorized that our tendency to reproduce grows exponentially, while our ability to produce subsistence grows linearly and will never catch up. Could that possibly be true? Are we doomed to have a problem of poverty with us forever? If that is true, we would expect to see correlations in the density of population. In other words, where people are crammed together the tightest, we would expect to see them have the hardest time making a living. But as we look around the world, we see that that is by no means true. One of the densest places in the world is the Upper West Side of Manhattan, with 42,500 people per square kilometer. And those people pay a lot of money for the privilege of living there. And they have all the creature comforts they could want. By contrast, a place like Mongolia has less than 2 people per square kilometer, and its economy is nowhere near as robust. When we look at population facts, we see virtually no correlation at all between the population density and the level of poverty and the difficulty that people have with providing for themselves. We're not going to go into this chart in detail because it has a lot of numbers. You see the web address for it on the bottom of your screen there, so you can look at it in depth at your leisure. It's a very interesting collection of population facts that we pulled out of the CIA World Factbook, and we do it every year. But for right now, let's just look at a simplified chart, and we're going to look at 5 places: the United States, Nicaragua, Ethiopia, Japan, and the entire world, for some correlations regarding population density and the economic health of the society. Oil consumption, we're calling barrels of oil per person per year. Yes, in fact, in the United States, the average person uses 21.6 barrels of oil per year to get by. Arable land density is the number of people per hectare of arable land. Arable land is defined as land that is either in farm production or is capable of being placed into agricultural production in a year's time. We see some very interesting correlations here. The United States and Nicaragua are very similar in terms of population density, but their economic output, of course, is very different. The United States has more than 10 times the GDP per capita as Nicaragua and more than 10 times the oil consumption in Nicaragua, even though their density of people per arable land is really quite similar, and both of them is below the world average in the number of people per hectare of arable land. A place like Japan, on the other hand, is very densely populated, and their economic output is quite high, 37,000 compared to the 48,000 per capita for the United States. Interestingly, their oil consumption for an advanced industrial economy is much lower per capita than the United States. And of course, their population density with respect to arable land is very high, and yet they are able to amply provide for all their people through economic efficiency and trade. A place like Ethiopia, on the other hand, whose economy is improving today, but is still quite low, with a GDP per capita of $1,300 a year, they have plenty of people per hectare of arable land. And so the more we look around the world, the less we see a correlation between population density and poverty. As a matter of fact, the opposite tends to be true. There's plenty of land. There's plenty of land to go around. We just have to use it efficiently and share it with some semblance of equity. So how much land do we need to get by? Rough estimates, links to which we will publish on our website, are that for a modern American diet, including an average amount of red meat and poultry that people eat, it takes about an acre a year to feed a person. On the other hand, for a vegetarian diet, which of course is a much more efficient use of land, and the favorite food of this veggie man here, you need only 35/100ths of an acre, or 14/100ths of a hectare per person per year. So we see that the amount of arable land in the world is able to feed 10 billion people, according to that estimate. So while a modern American diet is too wasteful to be sustainable worldwide, a healthy vegetarian diet is completely achievable, and we have ample amounts of land to do it with today. So there is no need, given the level of available resources, for there to ever be any hunger in the world. Hunger and poverty have to be a function of the distribution of wealth and the economic arrangements that make things so unequal. Henry George writes powerfully about this. In fact, George's refutation of the Malthusian theory in Progress and Poverty is seen as one of the classic arguments in the literature of political economy. It is this very fact, George writes, that want appears where productive power is greatest and the production of wealth is largest, that constitutes the enigma which perplexes the civilized world and which we are trying to unravel. Evidently, the Malthusian theory will not explain it. That theory is utterly inconsistent with all the facts. It is really a gratuitous attribution to the laws of God of results which really spring from the maladjustments of men. We have yet to find what does produce poverty amid advancing wealth. Which means, friends, that next week's lesson has to tackle that question. We're going to look at the principles that underlie the distribution of wealth and see what correlations and what laws we can identify there. Please do join us. Thanks.